In previous videos, I've discussed what might happen if Canada were reformed and ownership given back to native groups, and I've discussed some of my gripes with modern capitalism. This video is going to be taking another look at Canada to see if we can save the country. I have attempted to keep this list ordered chronologically, with policy changes and laws that could or should happen fastest listed first. Typically, when the Canadian government makes a new law or regulation, there is a timeline for it to take effect. Income tax brackets change each year. Property taxes are re-evaluated every year. When Canada legalized marijuana, it was fairly quick, but when new food packaging or construction code regulations are passed, there is typically at least 6 months' notice so people can start abiding by the new regulation before they would get punished for it. Exact numbers are estimates or negotiable wherever they appear. First off, I suggest a minimum wage increase to $50 per hour, coupled with a rent freeze and eviction freeze in effect for the first 5 years. Any hourly or salaried employees, including contractors making less than this, get upgraded to this amount. During that freeze, tie minimum wage to inflation. Preferably in the same legislation, but depending on voting feasibility, it might have to come into effect 2 or 3 years into the freeze. Second, implement rent maximum per square foot or per square meter set to a reasonable amount, tied to minimum wage. Based on prison regulations, a cell, which I'm substituting in for a bedroom, is minimum 7 square meters or slightly more than 75 square feet. Other existing rental and housing regulations require living facilities to have a kitchen and bathroom. I assume the kitchen is the same size as the bedroom, and the bathroom is half that size, and let's assume a small hallway or other separation between the bathroom and kitchen for sanitation. That brings us to a minimum of 200 square feet or 19 square meters for living space. Someone on minimum wage should be able to pay less than a quarter of their after-tax income on housing including utilities. Assuming minimum wage is tax-exempt, that leaves us with a maximum of $2,000 per month on rent. Maximum money for minimum space defines the regulation, so the maximum rental fee including utilities would be $10 per square foot, or $109 per square meter. Tying that to minimum wage translates to monthly rental fees including utilities per square foot shall be no more than 20% of hourly minimum wage. Again, these numbers are just for illustration purposes, and would be subject to debate before implementation. I'm not really sure if the Canadian government uses feet or meters when doing their calculations. Rental ads and real estate use square feet, as does land purchase, so I would guess property tax does also. However, we use feet and inches for people's heights for police reports, but use meters and centimeters for people's height on driver's licenses and medical care. So maybe I'm wrong to guess that it is consistent. For any viewers out there who are on salary or maybe monthly support, and don't know what their hourly wage would be for this comparison, here's some easy math. Take your annual salary rounded to the nearest thousand, drop the K, then cut it in half. That's your hourly wage. For monthly benefits, multiply by 12 first, then do the same. That quick conversion will change depending on your definition of full-time, since it assumes 40 hours per week, 50 weeks per year. I remember being in a 235 square foot apartment, paying $975 per month for rent including utilities. At the time, I think minimum wage was $15 an hour. Doing the math, under my proposed legislation, the maximum monthly rental price for that apartment would be $705 including utilities, which is more than 27% cheaper than what I was paying. Okay, I know what you're thinking. This is a lot of math and we're only on regulation 2, is this whole video going to be a math lecture? Well, sorry to disappoint, but most regulations and taxes are a lot of math. The third regulation I would advocate for is increasing the eviction notice deadline to 6 months. In Ontario, this is currently 60 days. I think 180 days or 6 months is more reasonable for tenants to find new housing. Some evictions happen because the tenant isn't paying rent, others happen because the landlord wants to change how the building is used. If the landlord is planning renovations or planning to move in themselves, then 6 months is reasonable. That's a fairly common timeframe for buying a house and being able to move in. As for the evictions due to non-payment, if the landlord can't afford to pay the mortgage and utilities for 6 months, then they shouldn't be a landlord. This is the same as if it was empty and they were having a tough time finding tenants who wanted to move in. The fourth change I suggest is less about economics, and more about preparing for automation, and increasing quality of life for people. We should change the legal definition of full-time work to be 20 hours per week instead of the current 30. If the previous legislation had already been enacted, this would cut in half the maximum rental fees. Although I think this definition change is necessary, I don't think it is sufficient. Years ago, the Canadian government changed the definition of full-time from 35 hours down to 30 hours per week. but many people are still working 40 hours a week, and overtime doesn't kick in until 44 hours per week. I propose that this legislation include that overtime pay is mandatory for any hours worked above the full-time definition, and that this must be calculated on a weekly basis, not bi-weekly as some companies do currently. I remember the first time I worked 50 hours in a single week and I was furious when my paycheck said 0 overtime. Turns out that company used the 88 hours over 2 weeks calculation, and there had been a stat holiday the week before my long overtime week, so I only worked 82 hours in that 2-week period, not enough to qualify for overtime. Absolute hogwash. My fifth recommended regulation change is about the different types of minimum wage, such as student minimum wage and tipped minimum wage. Everyone knows tipping is out of control. The old 10% after tax or 15% pre-tax for good service at a restaurant, or for delivery, has been replaced with buttons for 10, 20, sometimes 30% tip on way too many transactions. Why does Dairy Queen ask me for a tip? Why does the self-checkout at a grocery store ask me for a tip? Completely out of control. Am I supposed to tip for picking up pizza or other takeout food? To fight this, I propose the minimum wage actually be a minimum wage for everyone. It shouldn't matter if you're 16 or 96, if you're hauling UPS packages or pizza. No one deserves to be told they earn less than minimum wage. I could go on an angry rant about how there's no difference in productivity between 16-year-olds with no experience and 26-year-olds with no experience, or how people earning tips often have to deal with sexual advances or harassment, but I don't want my blood to boil too much, so I'll leave it at that. On a similar topic, one thing that I'm not sure is legally defined one way or the other is training. I think worker training should be considered regular working hours and be paid. I've heard of trial shifts at fast food places where the worker isn't paid, and I think that should be illegal. I've also heard of forklift drivers or heavy machinery operators needing to redo their certifications every couple of years, and I think that should be paid by the employer as well. Same goes for if an office employer wants a worker to get certified on a new accounting software or get first aid training, the employer should pay them for the hours it takes to do that. If you're sensing a theme here, you may expect this next topic. Wage theft. My sixth regulation change is to enforce that no more than 10% of a company's workforce can be contract employees. I'm looking at you Uber, your employees are not contractors. Truckers who want to be owner operations should be able to do so, but the company should also own most of their own vehicles and employ most of their staff. No more of this BS paying someone to deliver something halfway across the province, then not paying them for the return trip unless they find another company who has something to haul the other way. No more having the trucks waiting unpaid for loading and unloading. If vehicle maintenance, fuel, and insurance was paid for by the company, and the drivers got an hourly wage, then we wouldn't have people going further into debt by working. Speaking of my own experience, if information technology departments limited their consultants and contractors to only 10% of their workforce, then they would be forced to invest more in training their own staff and hiring more staff. There are so many people that were working full-time on a 2-year contract, and at the end of it they are just let go. Or you bring people on for a 3-month contract, get them to program something, then they leave and no one knows how it works, and you end up starting from scratch rather than trying to reverse engineer what they were thinking. I'm not saying we need to eliminate self-employed people, I'm saying we need a better definition of what self-employed is. If you're a consultant working for only a single client for multiple years, there is already a cut-off when the company is forced to consider you as a full-time employee, regardless of their or your feelings on the matter. I think that timeline is too lenient, but the fact that it exists already is precedent for enforcing a maximum on percentage of workforce being contract, consultant, or temporary workers. If you start thinking about snow plowing companies or lawn care companies who only hire people for a few months per year, you won't get any sympathy from me. Either pay your employees enough to live on for the full year and give them job security, or maybe you need to consider what else you can have those workers doing during their off-season that uses their skill set. My seventh recommendation is simplifying and streamlining Canada's income tax system. As I mentioned earlier, the income tax brackets and percentages can actually change every year, and I think we waste too much time and effort trying to recalculate them every year instead of using a sustainable system. I will keep the existing structure of having different tax brackets, and treating earnings separately in each tax bracket. For those who are not familiar, they use stupid numbers like the first $55,867 is taxed at a certain rate, and that dollar figure changes each year. And the provincial and federal income taxes don't use the same thresholds or percentages. Rounding to the nearest thousand, the 2024 federal income tax rates are 15% of the first $56K, then 20.5% of the next $56K, then 26% of the next 61k, then 29% of the next 73k, then 33% on any money after that, 246k for those keeping track. Ontario provincial rates are similarly dumb, like 5.05% of the first 51k, and 13.16% on anything above 220k. I propose zero income tax on people earning less than twice the annual full-time minimum wage, 50% income tax on earnings between twice and 5 times minimum wage, 80% between 5 and 10 times minimum wage, 95% on earnings above 10 times minimum wage. To compare that to the current system, let's look at a couple examples. Bob is working in a kitchen at a restaurant and has a few years' experience, so he's actually earning above minimum wage. He gets $20 per hour, or $40k per year, since the restaurant allows him to work full-time. Under the current system, he's paying about $5k, I'm not including CPP or EI. Under my system, since 20 is less than double the minimum wage of 17, he'd pay zero. Mark is an office working earning $80k a year. Under the current Canadian system, he's paying $15k. Under my system, his first $68k is tax-exempt, and he has to pay half of the remaining, so he's paying $6k. Tony is in management and earns $250k per year. He's currently paying $90k. Under my system, 5 times minimum wage would be $170, so he's actually crossing over into a higher tax bracket, and ends up paying $115k. The crossover between the two systems is around $170k currently, but mine is tied to minimum wage instead of, however, they are calculating their dollar thresholds. Anyone below that gets a cheaper ride in my system, and anyone above that gets a cheaper ride in the old Canadian system. As part of this, I'd also remove the delineation between capital gains, investment income, rental income, salary, tips, and lump everything together into the gross income before comparing it to the thresholds. Going by Google search, the highest paid CEO in Canada is J. Patrick Doyle, who earns $151.8 million per year. If that was entirely salary, no corporate gains or nonsense like that, the current system would have him pay $81 million. My system would have him pay $51k for twice to 5 times minimum wage, plus $136k for the 5 to 10 times minimum, plus $143,887,000 for the amount above 10 times minimum, for a grand total of $144,074,000. That's an extra $63 million per year to help fund social services. And he would still be taking home $7.7 million a year. Every dollar increase to the minimum wage saves him $8k per year in taxes because it is tied to minimum wage. Sure, $8k isn't enough to even shot up in numbers like $7.7 million, but anyone earning over 10 times minimum wage will also see that $8k tax savings per year per dollar increase to minimum wage, and on a salary of $500k paying $339k in taxes, that extra $8k might actually sway a vote in a similar way to a 1.5% tax cut. My 8th policy change is aimed at combating tax shelters and tax evasion. I don't have the exact wording yet, but in summary, multinational corporations would have to disclose their Canadian revenues, costs, and profits, segregated from the rest of their business, and those would be considered for corporate tax in Canada. For example, something like Tim Hortons or Walmart, which operates in both Canada and USA, each branch would have their own retail sales and costs, each warehouse or distribution center would either be in Canada or USA. Overhead costs for executives would only be considered Canadian costs if the executives being paid have Canada as their primary residence. Otherwise, that cost is ignored for the purpose of profit calculations. Other non-human overhead costs such as accounting software, website or app server costs would need justification for the corporation splitting the costs as they chose, with the ability for an auditor to overrule them if they were found to be over-representing their Canadian overhead costs. For online sales, revenue is taxed based on customer location, and cost considered based on cost location. If the call center taking orders is in Ireland, but the products are being assembled in Mexico and shipped to Canada, you might be in trouble because it looks like almost zero Canadian cost and almost 100% Canadian revenue and profit, which means your entire revenue is being considered for taxation instead of only the profit. This would definitely need refinement by international tax experts, but I think you get the basic point I'm driving at. For my 9th policy change, I'd like to have stricter economic sanctions on countries that have human rights violations recognized by the United Nations. For example, anything coming from Nestlé would have a massive import tariff to discourage slave labor in their cocoa supply chain and water theft in their bottled water supply chain. In recent news, I've seen 25% tariff on Chinese steel and aluminium, and 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Not knowing much about historical tariff rates for different things, I'd probably use those as a baseline and say Nestlé and Amazon, as well as anything coming from Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Ethiopia, Burundi, Eritrea, Qatar, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Democratic Republic of the Congo should have a 100% tariff on all imports to Canada. This list would be refreshed whenever the United Nations declares that a country has resolved their human rights violations, or when a new country is confirmed to have ongoing human rights violations by the United Nations. My 10th proposal is aimed at the housing crisis facing several Canadian provinces, which has been ongoing since before 2008. Any housing that has not been lived in for 5 consecutive years is forfeited to the government. Building inspections take place to ensure it is safe to live in. If it is safe and habitable, declare the building a homeless shelter, with annual building inspections and repairs paid for by the Canadian government, including electricity and water. If the residence is determined to be unsafe or uninhabitable, demolish the building and offer the land to native tribes at zero cost. If they don't want it, anyone capable of moving in who has an annual income of minimum wage or less can apply. First come first served, must not own another property or company. Think of this as the modern equivalent of 40 acres and a mule, which the American government advertised but rarely delivered to settlers. Once this poor person has ownership of the land, they are free to try to build on it, or sell it, or reforest it, turn it into farmland, whatever they choose as long as it doesn't violate any other laws. Some of you familiar with Canadian news may recall about a decade ago during the Syrian refugee crisis when the Canadian government used hotels to house refugees. It wasn't a great situation, but it was better than having them freeze to death in the winter. Imagine if we did something better than that for the Canadian homeless population. My 11th policy change is creating a civilian equivalent of the university tuition payment program for the military. The current system says you sign up, go to a Canadian university of your choice, and once you graduate, you work for the Canadian military for 4 years, with salary, and then they void any tuition debt from your time at university. That time spent in the military can already include working at a McDonald's on a nuclear submarine, or working as an accountant for the military. I think this should be expanded to all entry-level government positions. Get a university degree in chemistry, work at a government-owned pharmaceutical lab for 4 years with salary, then your debt is erased. Get a creative writing degree, work as a writer for a Canadian government-owned TV station or animation studio for 4 years. If your degree only takes 2 years, then you only need to work for the government for 2 years. If you want an 8-year degree, then you work for the government for 8 years afterwards, all paid at full salary of course. I think this system tackles both the unrealistic cost of post-secondary education as well as giving young people that first foot in the door to build a career in their chosen field of work. I would allow the system to be flexible enough that if the person doesn't end up sticking with the field their degree is in, they can transfer to other government jobs during their debt repayment years. Furthermore, I think a jobs program like this might help with the trend of people coming to Canada for education then moving out of the country immediately after. From what I've heard, this isn't a real economic concern, and hasn't been for most of our history, but I would use this as a way to convince some of the older, more racist members of parliament that this system benefits them too. Also, to alleviate the debt trap that many young adults find themselves in, I would either make the debt partial for non-graduates, or perhaps even forgive the entire debt for non-graduates. Like, if a person got 2 years into a 4-year degree and decided it's not the life they want, some voters might want them to do at least the 2 years they accumulated as a government worker in some form. Other voters may want this to function as universal public post-secondary education, so it doesn't matter if you graduate or not, you don't owe anybody anything, similar to public high school. I think using the military style year for year with pay would be a good stepping stone. See it working for maybe 10 to 20 years to get the culture used to it before swapping to free university for all. My 12th decree, since these really are starting to feel like dictatorial decrees, is to revoke the tax-exempt status for religious organizations. If an organization qualifies as a secular charity and just so happens to be religious as well, without discriminating in their services, then they can have tax-exempt status as a secular charity. On the other hand, if their only charitable work is preaching to people and collecting donations to renovate the church, then I'm going to classify that as a for-profit business and tax it accordingly. Further to that point, I would like to have stricter requirements for secular charity status. Of the money given to charity, if less than 75% of it goes to the stated goal, the organization should lose its status as charity and be considered a for-profit business. Any charity whose singular goal is raising awareness should also be considered a for-profit business. Okay, I'm less than halfway through my list and this video is getting pretty long. Stay tuned for part 2. If you would like me to further expound on any of these proposed policies, please let me know in the comments, or make a reply video and put the link in the comments. I'm more than happy to pin it and direct people to it if you provide quality feedback.